Dr. Alan Barclay is a best-selling author about diabetes and nutrition. He's also just presented to about 400 people with type 2 diabetes at Exposing Diabetes here in Brisbane today. Dr. Barclay, thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thank you.
I was very interested to see you telling people that vegetarian diet is often a better option than some of the other things that are put forward these days.
Absolutely. I think we forget that there's over 1 billion people in the world, Indian people, who have eaten vegetarian diets for millennia and done very well out of it, and it's becoming increasingly popular in Western countries as well. It's probably more environmentally friendly in many ways. And also there's a very large body of evidence, randomised controlled trials in humans, people with type 2 diabetes, that shows it's almost as effective at lowering average blood glucose levels, or HbA1c, as a Mediterranean diet. So yes, it's an option that I think we should be definitely considering. It doesn't seem to be as popular as some of the other diets out there. It definitely deserves more attention. And of course you can make it really tasty. I think, most communities have an Indian restaurant in their town, and there's some really great food. So choose the vegetarian options there, and it'll certainly be an option for you.
Vegetarian food isn't usually low carb.
No, it's not at all. So, but a traditional Indian diet will be high in legumes, so beans, peas, lentils, chickpeas, and also the rice they have is basmati rice. Now, basmati rice as a category has one of the lowest glycemic indices of all of the different types of rices, and there are quite a few basmati variants that are actually low GI, unlike most of the other rices, which are actually high GI. So I think over the millennia, the local Indians have perhaps worked that out, and certainly I've met a number of people from India over the years, including people that work in the health industry, and they reckon that each local province in India grows its own rice, and a lot of those provinces have low GI basmati variants. So I think, we're not actually looking for that. We don't put it on our nutrition information panels as much as we should. We don't screen our rice varieties for GI as such, and if we did that, I think we'd find that there are definitely healthy low GI Indian diets that people can enjoy in a traditional way. So I think, and we've got to look at that whole overall food supply, not just focusing on one particular aspect of it. Carbohydrates are important, but it's not the only factor.
Well, just moving on from there, what should people be looking at if they're trying to improve their HbA1cs or their blood glucose levels?
Yeah, well, the first and foremost thing for people with type 2 who we're talking about is losing weight, and losing at least 5% of body weight. So if you're 100 kilos, 5 kilograms is an absolute minimum, and that's not too difficult to achieve. But ideally, 15 to 20% of your body weight, that could actually put your diabetes into remission, which is what I was talking about. So, so that's a 15 to 20 kilo loss if you're 100 kilos. So, it's harder, but it's achievable. We're not talking about biggest loser kind of losing half your body weight. It is something that people can actually do. That will help. And then, of course, obviously we don't just eat calories. I think this is where it gets a bit confusing. People say that calories don't count. They do, they're very important, but we don't eat calories, we eat foods. So we've got to make sure that the foods that we drink, we've got to make sure the foods and drinks that we get those calories from are the healthiest versions available. So making sure they're minimally refined and processed, naturally high in vitamins and minerals and dietary fibre, and a good balance as well. So obviously the fat we can have either a low fat or a high fat diet. It doesn't seem to matter as long as we don't have too many calories, but obviously you've got to make sure the fats are good ones. Nobody's ever said you need to avoid all saturated fat. The balance needs to be right. So ideally it's for 1 gram of saturated fat we have 2 grams of mono or polyunsaturated fat, so it's a 1:2 ratio, for example. With the carbohydrates, again, you can go from a low carb to a high carb diet. It doesn't really matter, whatever suits you, and some people a low carb diet suits better than others. So, for example, an Australian Aboriginal would probably do quite well in a low carb diet, but an Asian person who has a very high carb diet, or a vegetarian person, it doesn't. So, there's horses for courses, and of course the remainder is protein. It is important. Australians have actually been eating more protein over the last few decades, but we haven't been eating good quality protein. In fact, we've increased the junk protein that we're eating, the protein balls, the protein powders. We're not eating more quality meats, poultry or seafood. That's stayed roughly the same, so it's the junk protein. So we really need to be careful. There's, all of the nutrients, there's good and bad. We need to make sure we choose the best quality variants of each of those within a kilojoule or calorie limit that will help us to lose weight, and ultimately, of course, we've got to keep it off, and that's the challenge with all of these diets. Certainly there's some evidence that the low carb diet's better over the short term, so 3 to 6 months, but at 12 months or 2 years, there is no difference between it and any other kind of dietary pattern. I think because it's not very palatable, it costs a lot of money, and basically it's socially disruptive. You know, particularly if you're from a certain cultural background, again, if you're from Indian or say Southeast Asian, you know, it just doesn't work with your culture, so you're not going to be able to stick to it. So they've got to choose a healthy option for them. So for them it could be a vegetarian option, for example.
What are some of the common mistakes people make? If we have type 2 diabetes, we're very aware that we should be eating well, we're very aware that we should be losing weight, but what are the things that people are doing that are stopping them achieving those goals?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I mean, food is just one part of life. I guess that's, and I mentioned in my talk, you know, there's this whole meme that food is medicine, but it's not. It's much more important than that. We celebrate it, you know, for all of our religious festivals, from Christmas, Easter, births, deaths, birthdays, etc. So, you know, there's that social component, and you know, also for our everyday enjoyment, you know, we meet friends, we have a drink, we have a meal. You know, we don't usually drink water at those meals. It's usually soft drink or alcoholic beverages. So, you know, there's all those factors. So food is just one part of our lives, and it's an important part. And I think changing the lifestyle, the person has to have maybe the other parts of their life sort of lined up, and they have to be ready. They have to be in the right place in their life to be able to put those lifestyle changes into action. And if they don't, then no matter what the diet is, it's not going to work. So I think, you know, we have to think of the greater psychology of us as people, and where healthy eating fits into our lifestyle. And the classic example is within the Aboriginal population of Australia, where they have so many other social problems, then probably what they eat and drink is probably one of the least things that they worry about. And the other factor that I really ought to mention is, of course, and I've touched on it, is the cost. Because you know, some of these dietary patterns are very expensive. We in fact price the cost of following the paleo diet the Australian way. A couple of years ago I had a master's student. It cost that person $300 per week to follow the strict paleo diet. Now that's a lot of money for an individual. Most families cannot afford that for the whole family, let alone per person. So, you know, you've got to take that into account as well. So money is a factor. And that's where maybe a vegetarian diet, which actually is based on, you know, lentils and chickpeas and what have you, is probably one of the cheaper alternatives. So these are all factors that we have to take into account. It's not just about focusing on a single nutrient, getting evangelical about it and saying that everybody should follow this diet or avoid that. That's not the way humans eat and enjoy food. Food is much more important than that.
Doctor, just very briefly, we've only really recently started a conversation about putting diabetes into remission in Australia. You've mentioned to me previously that other countries are ahead of that conversation.
Yep.
Where has the resistance come from, and how far are we on to moving that away from that?
Look, I don't know its origins. I think the body of evidence, and I talked about the levels of evidence in my talk, we really need randomised controlled trials in humans, and they need to be at least 12 months duration, because that's what we classify as partial remission, before we can really start talking about it. And it's only been in the last few years that we've got a sufficiently large body of evidence to prove that that is what can actually happen. And I was very pleased, just last month Diabetes UK, in its very latest evidence-based guidelines, has a whole chapter on putting diabetes into remission and talks about the various ways that can happen. So I think that's a watershed, because of course Diabetes UK is one of the world's oldest diabetes associations, and I would like to think that Australia might now start taking the concept seriously. Certainly when I published my book a couple of years ago, there was some pushback amongst certain quarters. Then the research wasn't quite as strong as it is now, even though I thought at that time, you know, this is there were still randomised controlled trials. They just weren't showing as positive results as the more recent ones. And I think that's because partly our dietary approaches, and they're using very low energy diets, they're improving, and the study designs are improving. So I'm thinking that the evidence for that is only going to increase, and it'll get to the point where it simply can't be ignored anymore. And I think it should be offered to people when they're first diagnosed, is to have some sort of program to help them put their diabetes into remission. Because even if it only puts them into remission for a couple of years, that's a couple of years without medication. It'll decrease their risk of complications. So, you know, and there will likely be, if we look at the diabetes prevention programs in pre-diabetes, you know, the benefits to their health have actually gone out for several decades, and I'm sure the same will happen with type 2 diabetes. So I definitely think it's worthwhile, and let's face it, it is not expensive. In fact, a typical very low energy diet regimen will cost around about $40 to $50 per week per person. You know, it's a hell of a lot cheaper than paleo diets. It may not be quite as palatable, you have to like milkshakes a lot, but you know, certainly they do work. And yeah, I mean, you put up with it. It's got to be, again, it's got to happen at the right time in your life. I say to people, don't have it around Christmas or Easter time. It's usually got to be in warmer months because you feel cold. So you've got to make sure you avoid sort of primary social events in your life that will disrupt it. But if you choose the right time and you have the right supervision, it can be very, very successful. So why not do it? There's really nothing to lose.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.